14 players selected. That ties the Ohio State record set in 2004. Most players from one school in a single draft. The one guy who was not picked that I thought would be was Thaddeus Moss. And if Thad Moss had been picked, LSU would have the record. But Thad went undrafted, which we'll certainly delve into some of the why. But as we know, LSU had 5 players taken in round 1. That's a school record. They had another 2 players go in round 2 with Grant Delpit and then Christian Fulton. When round 3 started, 3 players went: Damian Lewis, Lloyd Cushenberry, Jacob Phillips. To start the day on Saturday, the second selection on Saturday was the Washington Redskins taking Sadiq Charles minutes after trading Trent, holy crap, I just totally blanked, Williams to the 49ers. And then in round 6, Blake Ferguson went. We talked about Blake, who was trying. Blake will be with us at 5 o'clock. He had set his goal to go at number 165. That would have made him the highest drafted long snapper in the history of the draft. He went 20 picks later at 185, but still, 6th-round draft pick for Blake Ferguson, an awesome moment. We'll talk to him about it later. And then Stephon Sullivan went in round 7 to the Seattle Seahawks. So Ed Ogeron, his relationship with Pete Carroll pays off there as a couple of former Tigers go in the draft to the Pacific Northwest. Ed Ogeron was on off the bench earlier today. Here's what Ed said was his reaction to watching 14 of his players have their names called in the draft.
Very proud and humble, and very, very humble that their parents decided to trust us in our recruiting process and trust the things that we told them that, hey, if we do these things and we do the work, this is going to be the result, and it happened. So I was very proud to see that come true.
All right, let me go through I'll give you very quickly a thumbnail on each of the guys and where they went from my perspective. We've talked about Burrow. On Friday's show, we talked about the guys that each went in the first round. I think Cincinnati has far more offensive firepower than anybody's talking about when you consider the fact that you've got a 1,000-yard receiver in Tyler Boyd. You got a 1,000-yard rusher in Joe Mixon. You're getting A.J. Green back. And they used their second-round pick on T. Higgins from Clemson to add another dynamic weapon. So I think offensively, Joe Burrow is going to have a lot there. Can they keep him upright? We'll see. Chass on to Jacksonville. I think that's unfortunate because Jacksonville's not very good. But Yannick Ngakoue, their edge rusher, has said he never wants to play for Jacksonville again. So bit of a need there, and Chasson goes to a spot that makes a lot of sense. Curious about Justin Jefferson going to Minnesota because he is a slot receiver, and he's going to a spot where they have one of the best slot receivers in the NFL in Adam Thielen. So is Minnesota maybe thinking, hey, we saw you ran a 4.4 at the combine. We could play you outside. You can be that replacement for Stephon Diggs. We'll see, but that would make some sense. Patrick Queen to the Ravens makes a ton of sense. They have a hole there at inside backer, and Queen is a guy that rocketed up draft boards, and, John Harbaugh spoke glowingly about him after he picked him. And then, of course, the surprise for many in the draft, the pleasant surprise was Clyde Edwards-Helaire going in round 1 to the Kansas City Chiefs. He will be perfect in that offense. So when day 2 started, Grant Delpit and Christian Fulton, their slide moved into day 2. And it didn't take long for Delpit to come off the board, but he goes to Cleveland where there is a very obvious need for starters in their secondary, and he will very likely join Greedy Williams as a starter game 1 in the Cleveland Browns secondary. I hate it for Grant Delpit, but he's one of those guys that the injury, the questions about tackling, knocked him down a peg, and he didn't have the opportunity in the draft process to go answer those questions. The same is true with Christian Fulton. When we talked about him dropping on Friday when we were here, when we talked about Christian Fulton not going in round 1, my point was, look, it wouldn't be totally surprising but for the fact that 6 cornerbacks went in round 1. The run came on cornerbacks, and Fulton still didn't hear his name called, which tells you that there was more there for a lot of teams. And it's the suspension. It was the fact that he faced a 2-year suspension, and he didn't have an opportunity to get on a plane and go spend the day at a team's facility and let them get to know him and tell his side of the story. So that's unfortunate, but it cost Christian Fulton. So he goes 61 to Tennessee. That was the guy before the draft. How many times did I say it? Fulton had the biggest gap of any LSU player, where I wouldn't be surprised if he was a top half of round 1 guy If he would have gone in that spot where A.J. Terrell went, 16 to Atlanta, would not have surprised me at all. Instead, he goes 61 to Tennessee. Great value in the second round for the two teams that picked LSU guys. I thought Damian Lewis, I'm not sure if you saw, but DJ Fluker, former Alabama offensive lineman, the Seattle Seahawks have released him and then drafted Damian Lewis, which tells you they have a ton of confidence in Damian Lewis coming in to be able to fill that void right there. So big, physical, road-grading offensive lineman who is going to get a chance to be a starter as a rookie for the Seattle Seahawks. Lloyd Cushenberry going to Denver. They added a ton of offense to help their second-year starter in Drew Lock. So Cushenberry can play either center or guard. I love that move. And then, speaking of Cleveland, 5 LSU players now with the Browns. Odell and Jarvis, of course, Greedy, Delpit, and then they took Jacob Phillips. It's a great spot for Phillips, who can certainly be a special teams player. And if you put him as a thumper in the middle, he can also be a 100-tackle guy. So really good spot for Jacob Phillips. Sadiq Charles is really interesting because he's going to a spot where they have quarterback questions. Now, Dwayne Haskins, they used a first-round draft pick on him a year ago. But you got a new coach there as well with Ron Rivera. And Ed Ogeron last week said publicly that he advised Sadiq to come back to school. Sadiq ends up going in round 4, the second pick of the 4th round to Washington, after they trade Trent Williams. So the day starts, Cincinnati makes the first pick of round 4, and then the trade is announced that Trent Williams is going from Washington to San Francisco. The pick comes in, it's Sadiq Charles. They addressed left tackle. Ed Ogeron, on Off the Bench today, talked about Sadiq and the conversation that he had with Ron Rivera about Sadiq. And again, guy who missed half the season this past year because of multiple failed drug tests, although they've never said that on the record. That's what it was. And that's something that he had to answer for and cost him.
He had some off-the-field problems. Sadiq is a good young man. He is not I love him. I recruited him. He came to work every day. He had some off-the-field problems that he's got to shake. I think he has shaken them. If Sadiq would have stayed, he'd probably been a first or second-round draft choice. So if he can do the right things, which I think he can, they got to steal in the 4th round. And I told that to Ron. I said, Ron, I had no problem with Sadiq on a daily basis. He was a great young man. He never gave me a bit of problems as far as football-wise and work ethic.
So Sadiq Charles goes in round 4. His marijuana test cost him the opportunity to be a top 2-round guy. But clearly, what you can see with the 2 offensive linemen that were drafted, DJ Fluker out in Seattle, Damian Lewis in. Trent Williams out in Washington, Sadiq Charles in. You can see these guys are going to be given an opportunity to go win jobs right up from jump. Rashard Lawrence went in round 4 to the Cardinals. LSU's been a pipeline to the Cardinals for about a decade now, and they love LSU players. And they got another one in Lawrence. I hope he can stay healthy. We talked about Blake Ferguson, pumped for him, and then Stephon Sullivan goes to Seattle as well. Curious if maybe Pete Carroll looks at Stephon Sullivan similar to a Jimmy Graham type, a receiver playing tight end, a big pass catcher. It's an interesting spot for Stephon Sullivan there in Seattle to see if that works out. Now, the 6 players that signed undrafted free agent contracts, Derek Dillon, speedy wide receiver, gets his shot with the Giants. Michael Divinity went undrafted. He'll stay in the NFC South. He goes to Tampa Bay. Braden Fehoko, undrafted, signed with the Chargers, so he's headed out to the West Coast. Adrian Mcgee signed with the Saints. I cannot see Adrian Mcgee making that team when you look at Eric McCoy, Andrus Peat, just drafting Cesar Ruiz. You've got Nick Easton back as well. And then you look at Will Clapp and Cameron Tom battling for that swing lineman on the interior. It's hard to see where Mcgee fits in. But he's going to be in an NFL camp with the Saints and maybe put some good tape out there and an opportunity to catch on somewhere. Thad Moss is going to make the Redskins, and I think he might end up being their starter at tight end. And then Badara Traore signed with the Chicago Bears. So congrats to all the LSU guys who had their names called and those that signed free agent contracts. 20 of them in all will be on NFL rosters come training camp time.